Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Konica FP1 program. And here at Mostly Vintage Cameras we do like cameras which can take great images but do so in a idiosyncratic or quirky way. And thankfully the world gave us Konica and most of their cameras do have some interesting quirks, and the FP1 is no different. So I'll just take a little look around this camera. It seems to be a very conventional sort of an SLR camera in many ways. It was launched in 1981 and it was in production all the way through to 1983. So not very long at all. So I think we can conclude from that it wasn't commercially a particularly big seller. So why would that be? Well, in many ways this was quite groundbreaking, or at least in one way. But let's start, as always, by putting a battery in. Now, battery-wise, it's got a cover here, and it will take 4 LR44 batteries, which are known by various other names, 10L14, A76, etc. But I'm going to run it on this PX28, because it's what I've got to hand, which is an equivalent. Positive is that way. I just want to make sure I get this little fabric tag under the battery because it will make it easier to remove it later on. So that's the battery loaded up. Let's take a look at the top plate. And what we can see is there's not an awful lot going on here. There's no shutter speed dial. Well, there's no anything really. We've got a frame counter, wind on off switch. There's a second position which is battery check, and we'll see the battery check light in the viewfinder a little bit later. It just lights up a green light in the viewfinder. And that's about your lot. ISO dial over here because this is pre-DX coding. That's what you'd expect. But that groundbreaking feature, as far as I can tell, this was only the second camera ever made to have fully program exposure. That's to say the camera will choose the shutter speed and the aperture for you. Now the first camera to do that was the Canon A1, which of course is something of a modern classic, and that was aimed at a professional or very serious amateur, and it had aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, depth of field preview, 2 or 10 second self-time, and a whole bunch of other features. Very advanced camera for its age. And it came out something like 3 or 4 years before this Konica. The Konica, being the second camera to have program exposure, only had program exposure. It is just one exposure mode, fully automatic, which effectively makes it a point and shoot camera. The only controls you need to use as a photographer are focus and set the film speed, and that's your lot. So what I would like you to do is imagine a world where early cameras were fully automatic like this Konica. There were no manual exposure cameras, and one day someone comes along and says, hey, I've got this new camera, it's terrific, you can set the shutter speed and the aperture yourself, and if you get it wrong the camera will just go ahead and let you take the picture. You've got to do all the work, and you can get it wrong and make a mess of your photographs. I don't think if people were used to automatic cameras from the very early days of photography, a fully manual camera would be very well received. But of course, in this reality, cameras, certainly up to this point, were mostly manual, or certainly had a manual exposure mode. So a fully auto camera would have seemed to be taking control away from the photographer, taking creativity away from the photographer. But as we looked at with the EOS 750, there's a lot of photographers that just want a camera with an interchangeable lens that takes good pictures. They just want to have something where they don't have parallax error. So if I show you what I mean by parallax error, if I can remember how this LOMO works, there we go. So this is the lens and this is the viewfinder, and because they're offset, when they take a picture, the viewfinder will see this. Try and get that in frame, let's say that, and the lens will see that. So what I'm seeing in the viewfinder, particularly at near distance, is different to what the picture will come out like. and that can be an issue. That tends to chop things off. So if you are photographing your stamp collection, cake decorations, flowers, flower arrangements in the local church, that sort of thing, parallax error is a significant problem. And this camera obviously completely avoids that, being a single lens reflex. Equally, if your interest is photographing your children playing sport, maybe they're in the football team, or they're doing some other activity, ballet or whatever, you might want to use a bigger lens, which you can't get with a point and shoot camera, a traditional compact camera. So there is a user case for this camera when it came out, but again, it didn't catch on with photographic enthusiasts. It's perhaps worth noting that this was in fact the only camera, or the only SLR camera Konica made with program exposure. For whatever reason, Konica decided not to pursue program exposure automatic cameras beyond this point, which might give you a clue as to how well or not it sold. The lens on this, incidentally, all Konica lenses are marked hexagon, or you could argue there's one or two that aren't, but all Konica lenses basically are very good. This is a 50mm 1.8. It's a very common lens to find on this camera. There was a later f1.7, and people that like to discuss these things will tell you the 1.8 is better than the 1.7, but in reality I don't think there's going to be a lot of difference, especially, and it doesn't apply to this camera for reasons we'll come to, especially if you were to stop that 1.7 down a little bit. Now if you can find one with this lens, this is the 40mm 1.8. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner, so it's a bit smaller. It's a very nice focal length and a very nice quality lens. So if you can find a 40mm hexagon, essentially if you see any camera for sale with this lens at a reasonable price, you might want to consider picking it up, because even if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you can usually adapt this, and it's a really nice looking lens in terms of the images it produces. On the subject of interchangeable lenses, to change the lens, you press this lever here, turn the lens a quarter turn anti-clockwise, and away the lens comes. To put the lens back on, you take the red dot here, and you find the red dot on the lens, line them up, and it pops straight back on. Pretty standard stuff. This particular lens, you might not have noticed, had a bit of an accident in the post on its way to me, so sadly no filters on this, which is a bit of a shame, but there we go. One other thing when you put the lens on is you need to make sure you've got the lens set to the auto exposure position, the green position. So there's a silver stud just on the side of the lens. That will put it into the manual mode, which you might use on other cameras, but you need to have it on AE. So I mentioned, why doesn't it matter if this is a 1.7 or a 1.8 on this camera? And that's because the camera program mode is rather unique. Now admittedly there were at the time of launch only two cameras that had program, so it was bound to be a little bit different. But the shutter speed range is from 1/30th of a second to 1,000th of a second, and flash synchronization for reference is at 100th. But it only chooses between three apertures. So it'll either shoot at f2.8, 5.6 or 11. So if you're using a 1.4, 1.7, 1.8 lens, the widest aperture the camera will ever choose is 2.8. Now Konica did make a 28mm 3.5 and a 135 f3.5, which means that if you had a 3.5 maximum aperture lens, your exposures were going to be limited to f5.6 or 11, and that starts to look a little bit odd. And that shutter speed range stopping at 1/30th of a second means there is no option for long exposures. It seems to me that the whole premise of this camera is not so much to help you take great pictures, but rather to stop you taking bad ones. If you don't have long shutter speed, you can't get camera shake, for example. So that being said, let's take a look at what features we do have. ISO, as I say, is set on this dial here. It's a little bit fiddly. It runs from 25 ISO to 800, but if you look carefully, the extremities of the range aren't actually marked, which on a camera intended for consumer use, it might be a little bit fiddly. Now I find it easier to turn this dial if I lift the rewind release lever up a little bit, obviously being careful not to put it all the way up because that also opens the camera back. But with that up, it clicks into place. Very positive detents on this. Now you can fiddle the exposure, so if you think that you're going to get under or over exposure, you can change the ISO in a sort of poor man's exposure compensation dial manner. And that's about it. So we'll have a look inside the camera. And again, this is all, Konica do some great film loading systems, and this is no different. So just worth taking a quick look at the door hinge here, where it's got the advert for Sakura Color, or Sakura Color film, which was another brand name Konica were known as. There's no slot on the take-up spool, and we've got this funny little bar mechanism and roller there, and there's another pinch roller just on the inside of the door flap. Now it's worth noting this is a recess around the film door, and there's a flange on the film back, so light leak shouldn't really be a problem with this camera. There's no observation window in the camera back, so you're unlikely to get light leak there either. So we just pop the film in here, pull it over to the take-up drum, and close the back. Now on many cameras you have to press the button and wind on, press the button and wind on. This you don't need to press the button, it just winds on. And it's worth noting this little window here, where my thumb is, that will oscillate or rattle to and fro as you take pictures, as you wind on to show the film's moving correctly. So just press the button, it takes a picture, and you wind on. And that's all there is to it. There are a couple more controls on the front that we should probably take a quick look at. This socket here, it doesn't take a standard cable release, it takes a Konica proprietary release. And they did make, as well as a sort of a plunger cable release type thing, a button that's screwed into this socket. So if you were a left-handed photographer, you could trigger the button with your left hand, which is quite cool. There is also a self-timer, which is activated by this little combination of tally lamp and button. So if you press that in, and 10 seconds later it will take a photograph. And it flashes increasingly fast as it gets nearer the exposure. There we go. On the base plate we can see we've got electrical contacts and a cam, or a drive shaft I should say, for a automatic wind on. There was an auto winder F. There were also some quite interesting accessories for this, including a wireless remote control system, and this is 1981, remember. That works across the whole Konica F range, the FC1 and FS1 and so forth. And there was also an intervalometer. Almost couldn't say the word then. So if you wanted to do one of those time-lapse type photograph projects of a construction site or something like that, an automatic only exposure camera with an intervalometer and an auto winder, not the worst idea in the world. The flash units for this, Konica made 3 flash units, basically in different powers. They all prefix X, X18, 24, or I think it was a 36, and that relates to the guide number. So, bit of an odd camera when it was new, not massively popular with the buying public, which is a bit of a shame, because as a point and shoot camera it's actually terrific. You can put a wide angle lens on, you can put a telephoto lens on, and you can get SLR viewing, so no camera shake. Now of course it is a little bigger and heavier than your typical point and shoot camera, but in 2022, if you wanted a point and shoot camera for ease of use rather than compact size, this actually could make a lot of sense. And let's compare and contrast. So a very popular camera these days is of course the Olympus Trip 35, and you could easily spend £150 on one of those. I don't personally think they're worth that kind of money, and I certainly didn't spend that much on mine, but they are going comfortably in excess of £100, and I would say for a nice one, but so many of them actually don't work. You might well end up with a faulty camera. But you know, bit of 1960s style chic, I suppose you would say. The Loma LCA, that's a kind of a special case because people buy it for the wonderfully peculiar lens on it. We'll cover that in another video, I dare say. And again, they sell for crazy money these days as well. I used to sell those back in the 80s for £50. And then you've got the usual run-of-the-mill sort of point and shoot automatic cameras. There's a couple of examples. Let's move these around a little bit. Konica AFS and Fuji DL200. The Nikon L35 AF, Canon Sure Shot Supreme, etc. will be other examples. And again, great cameras, but essentially anything with an f2.8 lens is going for pretty big money. And what you get is just an automatic camera with, you know, a fixed lens. There are some zoom compacts, of course. Let's pop those to one side. Now this guy you can pick up for between £30 and £50 with some kind of a lens. It'll probably be a 50mm 1.8 or 1.7. If you're very lucky, it'll be that 40mm we looked at earlier. And for that sort of money, for, you know, a third of the price of an Olympus Trip, it's very hard to see. You've got a wider shutter speed range on this. Okay, the aperture situation is a bit peculiar, but really those three apertures, 2.8, 5, 6 and 11 are all people are going to need really, plus the SLR viewing and a self-time which you don't get on the Trip, make this quite an attractive proposition in that sense. Of course, if you want to be, as they say, creative, and you want to control aperture and shutter speed and all that sort of thing, then this is not going to be the camera for you. We should, I suppose, just rewind the film for completeness sake. Just press the rewind release button here. This film loading system, and I always bang on about film loading because it is so important. If you don't load the film correctly, it doesn't matter what sort of camera you have, you're not getting any pictures. Full stop. So many photographs have been ruined by people loading their film incorrectly. So anyway, that's been the Konica FP1 program. Woo, that was a bit dramatic. I hope you've enjoyed this video and perhaps found it useful. Thank you so much for watching, I really do appreciate it, and do have a good day.